I hope we grow. I hope we can find a way of seeing it all alive. I hope we can be.
Salutations. I believe I have found the Achilles heel of atheism.
God is the greatest possible being that could exist in any possible world.
No one had really structured the ontological proof in a way that you can avoid criticism.
Because premises 2 through 5 are uncontroversial. They just flow from axiom 5 of S5 of modal logic.
3.
Possible world does not refer to a planet or a universe, but rather possible world is a description of what reality might be or the way the real world could have been.
2.
A maximally great being is the greatest conceivable being. This includes such qualities as omnipotence, omniscience, omnipresence, necessity, and moral perfection.
1.
Therefore God possibly exists, therefore God exists.
Therefore God exists.
Therefore, God exists.
The Christian God, which is the one that is almost always being referred to when philosophers and apologists construct, argue for, or defend ontological arguments, cannot have the properties of maximal greatness to begin with. This is because the Christian God, being by definition immaterial, has no primary attribute, and that which has no primary attribute cannot have secondary attributes like omnipotence, omniscience, omnibenevolence, or moral perfection. A primary attribute is the fundamental identity of a thing, its compositional nature. Examples include plastic, copper, flesh, matter, energy, or aluminum. A secondary attribute is the character traits or abilities a particular thing may enact or possess. This includes wisdom, generosity, love, knowledge, power, strength, or kindness. And a relational attribute is the ability of an entity to relate to other things, to interact, affect, or be connected in some way. Examples include being taller than, superior to, inferior to, or creator of. Trying to give secondary or relational attributes to something like the Christian God, which lacks a primary attribute, is similar to trying to claim that the human concept of nothing can love. It's impossible and violates the law of identity. The properties of perfection or maximal greatness are self-refuting. An entity cannot be omnipotent and omniscient. If one is omnipotent, one can never know or experience fear, which means the entity is not omniscient. If one is omniscient, one can never know or experience ignorance, which means that entity is not all-powerful, since the inability to be ignorant represents something it doesn't have the power to know or experience, which means it's not omnipotent. If one is morally perfect, one cannot be or render immoral behavior, which means that entity is not omnipotent. Since the properties of perfection or maximal greatness / excellence are contradictory, it is not possible that a maximally great being can exist to begin with. All ontological arguments commit the fallacy of a non sequitur. It does not logically follow that just because one can conceive, wish, define, or imagine something, it exists necessarily from that definitional or imaginary conception. This is founded on the fact that the mind does not have such magic powers. Such a premise asserts the idea that consciousness has primacy over existence, which is utterly invalid metaphysics, as it reverses the proper subject-object relationship.
This is a pretty important point, because if you can show that something is not logically impossible, then it's epistemically possible. Therefore, something can only be epistemically possible if it is logically possible. Can we prove that the statement, "it is not possible that God exists," or "God's existence is necessarily false," can we prove that wrong? Well, yes, because we can prove that there are no self-contradictions in the concept of God. How can we prove this? Simple. We can prove it because the concept of God is man-made. By definition, even if you believe that God exists, it's man-made. So, therefore, since man cannot create self-contradictions, I mean, can you imagine self-contradictions? I can't, you can't, and it therefore follows that, the concept of God cannot be self-contradictory. Now, if there are no self-contradictions in God, it's logically possible that God exists. Ergo, God exists in some possible world, ergo, He exists in every possible world, ergo, He exists.
To conclude, we have ultimate refutation number 4, conceiving the inconceivable. I can imagine in my mind that 2 plus 2 equals 7, which is contradictory. I can conceive of the thought that a man can run faster than light, which is also contradictory. I can even conceive of the statement, "I never communicate," which is also contradictory. Therefore, man can conceive of contradictions, which means just because man can conceive of something does not mean it can't be self-contradictory. But I want to go a step further and postulate the fact that man can't even conceive of God to begin with because of the very fact that God doesn't exist and can't exist. I postulate that all ontological arguments are disproved and invalid not just because of the prior refutations, which were more than enough in themselves, but simply because God, being non-physical, cannot be conceived of to begin with, since the human mind can't conceive of nothing. Let's run some thought experiments. I want you to think about the human concept, nothing. I submit to you that you can't. The reason why is because the human mind cannot conceive of that which cannot exist. When you think of nothing, you would likely think of 4 things. Number 1, you would draw a blank, which means you're not actively trying to think about nothing. Number 2, you would think about the word nothing. Number 3, you would think about the meaning of the word nothing. And number 4, you would think of a black void. None of the above is the thought of nothing. All are something except for the drawing of a blank, which is simply lack of focus. The same goes for the God concept. When you conceive or imagine God, you aren't imagining a God, not just because God doesn't exist, but because God can't exist. When you honestly try to think about God, you'll likely do 4 things. Number 1, you'll draw a blank. Number 2, you'll think about some humanoid anthropomorphized God. Number 3, you'll think about the word God. And number 4, you'll think about the meaning of the word God to you and the associated feelings. In none of the above 4 did you actually think about God, including number 2, since the only reason you were able to think of number 2 is because the humanoid God has a primary attribute. For example, try to conceive or imagine a tire. The reason why you could is not only because a tire does exist, but because a tire, since it has a primary attribute, can exist. The reason why you couldn't conceive of God is because God doesn't exist, and most importantly, can't exist. Something immaterial can't exist. A supposedly immaterial entity is the same as the human concept of quote-unquote nothing. And the state of nothing, like the existence of an immaterial entity, is impossible, and that's why humans can't conceive or imagine either one. And that concludes this presentation on why all ontological arguments are refuted and disproved.